He's the man of the hour, too sweet to be sour. What you see is what you get, and what you don't is better yet. He's the women's pick and the men's regret. And if you went against Chael Sonnen, you made a bad bet. Now, obviously, a great way to support this channel and my content on the side is by buying some delicious gamer subs. Sugar-free energy formula, has a nice long plateau, doesn't have the crazy crash at the end or the spike along the way. Lots of delicious flavours. Get 10% off with the code Thorin, Thorin, at gamersubs.gg. Now, Chael Sonnen is one of the best showmen and talkers in MMA history. And he's also a relevant figure because of his work in the media space now as a content creator and a fight analyst. But he is consistently dismissed and undervalued for how good he was as an actual fighter and what his skill set was in MMA. Now, one of the problems he has, as you'll see, is his record isn't very good if you look over history. Because, I mean, for a start, he's been in Bellator since 2017. He was fighting a long time before the UFC in many, many different smaller organizations, and he built up a bunch of losses, mainly, as you'll find out, because a fatal flaw of him was getting submitted. So also, I'll add in, if you're a trash talker, you've seen this with all the great trash talkers, it's actually one of the functions, one of the features of trash talking, not a bug, is that it makes people despise you, but then they're willing, because they now hate you instead of being indifferent, they don't love you, they never would love you, but now they hate you, they'll tune in and watch you fight in the hopes you'll lose. And so because they hope you lose and they don't like you, when you're a great trash talker, people want you to lose. People want to say that you suck and you are bad, as you've said the other guy is suck and he's bad. Essentially, they just want to, they think getting revenge on you and to punish you is to do to you what they're getting mad at you doing to the opponent, which is trash talking. They want you to lose. They want to trash talk you back, even though they're just Jimmy No Name in the nosebleed seat / the peanut gallery. But that is essentially part of the electricity of what makes the sport work, isn't it? Now, one of the interesting things is, obviously, I'm going to do one of those ones where I show you his record and we'll go through a bunch of the big fights and I'll explain to you why actually he has a way better resume than people realise. Here we have the old classic Wikipedia. So obviously you'll see here, he's 46 years old now, and he is now retired, although he was still fighting at the end for the big box in Bellator. If people don't know, around the time that I talk about his prime, he'd have been about 30 years old. Obviously, he was a wrestler, so he will have had mad wear and tear on him since he's been doing that since he was a kid and cutting weight since he was a teenager, etc. His dad apparently is quite strict, and wrestling was like the main thing he was into. And he's one of those guys who just worships wrestling. People don't know Chael Sonnen's background. Before he got to the top of MMA, he was training with people like Randy Couture, etc., and Dan Henderson, etc., the absolute best of those like Team Quest guys that were around that area that he lived in, like the Northwest or whatever, Oregon or whatever. And he just knew these guys, and he would train with some of these guys as just like as a practice. I think he was an alternate for the Olympics in wrestling. Like, this is a guy who, his pedigree is actually quite interesting as well. It's not a surprise actually who he was able to follow on from. So if we go down to his record, look, when you see his final record is 31 wins, 17 losses, a lot of losses, by the way, and 1 draw / no contest. If you look into this, and then you consider he lost his last 2 fights, he lost 4 of his last 6. By the way, the wins are mega washed Vanderlei Silva and Quinton Jackson. And even the losses is like washed Fedor, washed Lyoto Machida, mega washed Tito Ortiz. Not really washed, but like on the way to it, Rashad Evans. At least he was coming off his peak, wasn't he? So beyond the Rashad Evans fight, really, these aren't real fights. These are just for money. These are for the show. This is almost more like wrestling, this part of it. Up until the Rashad Evans fight, these are real. This is his real career. This is a real competitive career. So for me, that's more like the real record of what he has. Like the rest of it, it's like Anderson Silva fighting for 10 more years for his contract to get a bunch. No one counts that in Anderson's like GOAT case or against him. We all know he could have just retired like after the second Weidman fight and just gone off into the sunset. We'd all probably call him the GOAT. So what we'll do with Chael Sonnen is we've got to go all the way back. We've got to start at the beginning. Because what you'll see is, even some of his earlier fights and losses, long before he gets to the UFC, look, he doesn't get to the UFC until 2005 at UFC 55. Before that, he's in all the other promotions, everything you can find. Like, he starts in Battle of Fort Vancouver, whatever that is. Rumble on the Reservation, as in they have like a casino set up and could do, therefore, fight some gambling sport events. And so he's on some Indian reservation for this one against Jason Mayhem Miller. You keep going. Danger Zone. Anyone ever heard of that? I haven't. Real Fighting Championships. He fought in everything. Pancrase, that was still around at this point in time. Loads of stuff. Loads of different like one-off tournaments. There's all of, obviously, eventually WEC, which was, especially for his division, was one of the separate orgs that eventually got bought by the UFC. Then they initially used it mainly just to have the lightweights and the smaller divisions, but eventually they just combined all of that into the UFC, hence why people like Dominic Cruz and Jose Aldo came over. And Chael Sonnen was someone where, even though there was always a middleweight division, obviously, in the UFC, he was fighting over in the middleweight division in WEC initially because he wasn't as big a name, and then from there, he then transitioned to the UFC. So in the early days, the key thing is here, some of these opposition aren't bombs. Like, for example, in his second fight, he wins a fight over Jason Miller in 2002. Now, if you don't remember, Jason Miller, aka Mayhem Miller, up until this is in 2002, up until something like 2010 or something, 2011, this guy was a top competitor at this weight class. This was a guy who almost beat Jake Shields to be the Strikeforce champion. He's had some very, very big fights against the best in the division, and it was only at the end, through a mixture, I would speculate, if you look at his life, of mental health issues and some injuries that seemed to sort of gas his skill set. Otherwise, he actually had a pretty well-rounded skill set. He was a good fighter. He beat him early on. Then, these are a bunch of no-names we don't need to worry about. Then his first loss comes against Trevor Prangley. Now, if you don't know, this is a guy who had loads of fights in the early days of MMA, the 2000s, and famously had loads and loads of submissions. It's not really a massive shocker that he gets submitted by an armbar by Trevor Prangley. He was actually an underrated name, a guy who has a lot of experience under his belt, very good fighter all round as well. Then he has a draw against Akihiro Gono in Pancrase in Japan. Who really cares about that? He beats Renato Sobral, who actually at this point in time was still a decent fighter in the division. Obviously a bit of a rock'em sock'em, sort of like poor man's Vanderlei, but a skilled fighter. Then he lost his second fight, this time to Forrest Griffin. You will notice the trend. He loses by a submission. And when does he lose? He loses this one in the first round, the other one in the first round. So Forrest Griffin obviously later on became a champion in the UFC. He loses to him. He beats Jason Lambert, who's a decent person. Keep going up. Jeremy Horn. Actually, maybe, I might even, here's the thing, Jeremy Horn also, maybe I'm actually mixing up Trevor Prangley and Jeremy Horn. They're both people who had massive amount of fights under their belt, loads of them. This time he actually got knocked out by him, TKO, says it's a cut, so I assume it was just a bad cut. I think I've seen all these fights back in the day. This one maybe then's not that bad a loss in that case if the doctors just stopped it due to a cut. I'd have to go and look at that. When I went back and watched it, I'll get to this point of the famous trash talk of never lost a round, because actually watching these early fights, you'll know what he means, but let's keep going for a little bit. So if we go up, then he loses also to the Japanese guy by decision in Pancrase over in Japan. Obviously, Chael Sonnen is not really a fight you associate with fighting in Japan. He lost to Jeremy Horn in another fight. Jeremy Horn, by the way, is a fabulous submission artist. Not really surprised you're losing to him. Then he lost to someone called Terry Martin, who people might remember from a long, long time ago. Was a solid enough fighter. Went on to have some UFC fights, but was mainly sort of a journeyman. You keep going. He loses to Babalu, which is Sobral, if you don't remember him. You can get knocked out. That can happen. He wins against Trevor Prangley to avenge that. He loses a third time to Jeremy Horn. He just kept fighting this guy, and he loses again by submission. Third submission to this guy too. So you can see, and Chael Sonnen, by the way, acknowledged this in many interviews, being submitted was one of his big problems. He had some sort of a mental block where, even though he's a wrestler, so the natural potential counter is people, when you're in their guard, beating them up with control, they try to submit you from the bottom. They try to get you in an armbar, a Kimura, Americana, omoplata, fucking, obviously in theory, if they could, they'd spin around and get rid of mainly obviously the arm triangle, as happened to Anderson Silva. Loads of times he would lose like that. And famously, it was actually usually the trend was in the second round, you'll see later in his career. So it's quite interesting that already that's established. This is how he's getting his losses. But here's the interesting detail. You've probably heard, as I just alluded to, one of the pieces of trash talk Chael would often make, right up until the point where he became kind of a joke fighter, he was just doing the Bellator fights, is he would always say that he'd never lost a round in fighting. Now, I'm not talking about the joke of after he lost to Anderson being but I thought if you're chap, you just lose the round, and so I was up 4-1 and I win the fight. He's obviously joking, and that's being witty, right? But when he says he never lost a round, now look, he did, in the sense that when you lose the fight, essentially you lost that round, didn't you? But in terms of a judge judging a round, if you actually go and look until very well into his career, after he's fought people like Anderson Silva, you can go and look, and actually he's sort of right on all these scorecards in loads of these early fights, and basically most of the fights of his career, because he's a dominant control wrestler, he is winning most of these rounds. Now, if he then gets sobbed or knocked out in the second or third round, yes, he loses the fight, and by that logic, he loses that round. But in terms of judging the rounds that finish and then get judged by the judge, he he actually was someone, because of his style, one of the most effective point fighting styles in MMA. He was actually someone who, it's true, even though he's lost a lot of fights, as I'm showing, he's also basically winning right until the second he loses, like the Scara thing from League of Legends, which was never a stupid comment. Stupid people just interpret it that way because a stupid person has to take something smart, condense it down in something simple to fit it in their brain, doesn't it? So then when they repeat it, it comes out as stupid, even if it didn't start that way. So there's actually a lot of nuance in his career, as you'll see as we keep going. So then when he go up, he's beaten a bunch of people who are more, again, just journeyman people here. We haven't even got this one. We're in Bulldog fight. We haven't actually got to the UFC. But hey, look, they all have pages. So these aren't just like when people have like a million Brazilian names at the bottom when they start out in Brazil. They're all just nobodies that have no page at all. You've never heard of the organization. Like, people will know what Bulldog was. It was like a poker card room back in the day online. So obviously he had fuck tons of money. You keep going up. Now he gets in a WEC, and you'll see he actually in his first fight fights for the WEC middleweight championship, and he loses. Now, for people who don't know, because there was obviously middleweight in the UFC, what's interesting is this detail. Now, you're going to think, but the best middleweights must have been in the UFC. Yes, in general, but not totally. There were some at the top of WEC who were as good as the best in the UFC. Now, already you're going to think, no way, because you might know who is the UFC champion in middleweight in this era. It's obviously Anderson Silva, who later on Chael goes on to fight. Well, what you might not know is Anderson Silva and this guy, Paulo Filho, this Brazilian fighter, were actually, I believe, in the same gym, and they had the same manager, that Ed Soros guy, who famously Chael later made fun of with the pig Latin comment about speaking English and translated from Portuguese Brazilian. But actually, because they were practice partners, what they used to do is, you know how like for a while you couldn't get, obviously, originally, believe it or not, you actually couldn't get John Jones to fight Rashad Evans because they were like, we train together, so we don't want to fight each other because, like, you know, we're like friends and that, and we're in the same gym. So the way they got around it in this team, as far as I can tell, is Anderson Silva fought in the UFC and he was the champion, and then Paul Filho fought in the WC and he was the champion. And presumably they didn't want to fight, and the rumor went, or Chael Sonnen said this himself, that in practice, actually, Paul Filho was the only guy who could beat Anderson Silva. Supposedly it's one of the only people Anderson Silva wouldn't want to fight. So Chael Sonnen goes and fights him, and you'll see he loses this initial fight by submission, an armbar, his classic fatal flaw. He's lost his first championship fight for like a meaningful championship. This is like a good one if you win this. Then he goes to the WEC, he beats Brian Baker, he comes back and he gets another middleweight championship fight. Okay, let's have a look at this. He's getting another one. And what happens is he wins this fight by decision, but he never gets to be a champion. You might not know, Chael Sonnen was never a champion at the top level in MMA, even though essentially he's just won the championship fight against the best guy in this particular promotion, WEC. But the problem is, Paulo Filho had some kind of like extracurricular problems. I believe it was implied he had some sort of a drug issue. And basically, he fucked up the weight cut and didn't make weight. So then when they had the fight, this guy, by the way, was at 192 pounds. When they had the fight, Chael Sonnen won, but as a result, the belt wasn't on the line, so there was no WEC championship to Chael Sonnen. He never was officially the WEC champion. Although, interesting detail, I saw in a documentary about him that actually he has that belt, because here's what's cool. Apparently Ed Soros and Paulo Filho did just send Chael the belt, because they were sort of like, look, in the spirit of like actual competition, you did beat us and we missed the weight, so you deserve this belt. And you are a champion. So in a sense, he was a champion and did beat one of the absolute best, or maybe the best middleweight at the time. Obviously, that's more debatable. But the point is, that is a real discussion point. So then you keep going up. Now we're starting to really cook, by the way, because at this point in time, you're obviously mega, and you could be WC champion. So he comes over and he's in the UFC. We're at 2009 now. He's in the UFC and he fights Damian Maia. Now, people will know Damian Maia is one of the best fighters ever in the UFC in terms of like, look, not the champion level, but like if we're talking about just overall fighters, one of the best ever. Especially, he might actually be the best ever mixed martial arts submission artist, like the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter. Bearing in mind, people like Marcelo Salas don't really try MMA that much, etc. Right? Realistically, it's between what? Maia, we're talking like Okami. There'd be a few others as well, but there's not that many. Damian Maia is as good as they ever came, especially in an MMA fight, to doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And this was the one where he did that legendary one where, like, from being held up in the air, almost like, you know, a slam position. So he did like a mad, crazy triangle out of nowhere to Chael and just beat him straight up super fast in the fight. And this was really shocking. This is actually, if people don't remember, what got Damian Maia up to his title shot against Anderson Silva, the one where famously he didn't really do much because he's a Jiu-Jitsu guy. Anderson Silva just waited so he could counter him, and then Anderson Silva had some beef against him, kept insulting him in Portuguese, and just refused to fight him, which, by the way, is part of the reason why Chael got to fight Anderson Silva, because after that fight, and the Taller's latest fight, where basically Anderson Silva just ran away the whole time, refused to engage because they were both counter-strikers, Dana White was pissed with Anderson Silva. Like, he thought, you're basically like wasting the pay-per-view guys' money who buy these fucking fights to make some sort of weird point or not fight in the fight. So he gave him Chael Sonnen, thinking this is a pressure fight. There's a guy who's called him out. There's a guy who says he's not even good, who wants to like sort of prod him and stick his finger in his chest and make a fight with him. And I would say this, I think Chael Sonnen is the best thing that ever happened to Anderson Silva's career. Not only how epic the win was that made him like a hero again, but he was actually becoming something of like an anti-hero or villain to fans. They were actually booing this guy, but he became a massive fan favourite after Chael's shit talk, and he beat Chael Sonnen. Because then, just like even if he didn't like Leon Edwards, as soon as he said that stuff, Colby, about his dad, loads of people suddenly wanted Colby to lose, whether they were a fan of Leon Edwards or not. I'd say it's that phenomenon was sort of going on. So then if you go up, even though he's lost this fight, it's a fantastic person to lose to, by the way. Plenty of people have had a hard time with Damian Maia, especially wrestlers, by the way. He was one of the best ever at actually like out wrestling and being dangerous to wrestlers. You go watch that John Fitch fight he had as well. Then after that, he fought Dan Miller, who everyone knows was always sort of like above journeyman. He wasn't quite championship level. He was just a fucking gamer though. Really tough guy, well-rounded skill set. He beat him in a decision. Then he beat Yushin Okami. And this is where I know people didn't watch these fights and they don't know who these fighters are, the context. Because if you know this period onwards, from Paulo Filo into the Yushin Okami win, Nate Marquardt, and this streak he goes on now is the peak of Chael Sonnen's career. This is when he is an absolute fucking monster. One of the absolute best middleweights in the entire world. Really, really tough to beat. Because when he fights Nate Marquardt has already been a championship fighter. He's someone who's gone over and I think maybe it was after this he won the Strikeforce champion, becomes a champion Strikeforce. I actually think, by the way, he was one of those people, a bit like Dan Henderson, where they probably deserved a second crack at Anderson Silva and maybe could have got it done the second time, but the first time they didn't really know what they were facing, because let's be real, Anderson Silva could be the GOAT of MMA, couldn't he? So at this point in time, Nate Marquardt is incredibly dangerous. This is when he really is Nate the Great, and he has got a mega skill set. He's really good at striking. Just go look what he did to fucking Tyron Woodley with those elbows. That's after this, I believe. He had the really good jiu-jitsu. That's one of his main skill sets. So you think he's going to be dangerous off the ground. He himself actually has a skill set of like coming from, he's American, so he knows like wrestling stuff, etc. He gets fucking manhandled in this fight by Chael Sonnen. You're going to think because it says decision, this can't be that good. No, look, Chael Sonnen's problem is when he does the ground and pound, it doesn't tend to like cut you up or make you bleed or make you look super bad, because he doesn't have like super powerful punches. But man, just look aesthetically how he just dominates this guy, constantly controls his position, postures, and then just beats him up from the guard and just constantly the whole fight. And Nate Marquardt, this is like an early example of that famous scenario where Poirier fought against Khabib and he said to his corner, I just can't get this guy off me. And it's like he couldn't get a breather. That's what this fight's like. Like Nate Marquardt's one of the best in the world. We're thinking he's going to win this fight, by the way, and go and rematch Anderson Silva and maybe even become the champion. And instead, Chael Sonnen ragdolls him like the whole fucking time. And you can tell Nate Marquardt's a bit frustrated. He can't do anything. And every time he goes down, like prime Khabib, you don't get back up when Chael Sonnen has you down. He holds you and controls you and makes you carry his weight and does loads of pity-pat punches to you and constantly just keeps posturing up and controlling you. But this guy knew what he was fucking doing. Like, this fight was really impressive. This is when you knew this guy has to fight for the title one year. So he's already controlled Yushin Okami like that, by the way. Similar scenario. If people don't know, Yushin Okami was the same story before. Before this, Yushin Okami was someone that people were saying, I mean, he had that weird thing where he'd already technically beaten Anderson Silva, but that was because of like an illegal kick. But himself, Yushin Okami's a massive middleweight who was quite strong, who was working on his wrestling and could certainly fight as a tough guy. And again, Chael Sonnen ragdolls him, then he ragdolls Nate Marquardt. These are, by the way, people who either fought Anderson Silva or Okami later does get to fight Anderson Silva. He becomes the number one contender. Chael Sonnen just manhandled these guys. He didn't get like a finish, but really impressive stuff if you go watch these two fights. It makes you realize how powerful his wrestling is. Then he fights the fight everyone should have seen, the Anderson Silva fight. But have they really? Because I feel like people just know the story that he trash talked. He lost to Anderson Silva both times. And at the end, Anderson Silva wins with a triangle. I think they know that part. But No one has ever done to Anderson Silva what Chael Sonnen did. Look, Chris Weidman caught him and knocked him out. That was big. People have beaten Anderson Silva. Obviously, he had that ridiculous one earlier in his career in Pride where the guy did a flying leg lock. This guy took Anderson Silva, beat him consistently on the feet, took him down at will over and over again with singles and double legs, controlled him, held him down, beat him up, had him literally saying stuff to him and the referee, like, let's just end the fight, like, oh, stop, I'm so injured. Like, had this guy just mentally broken. And for real, for over 4 rounds, he was fucking working Anderson Silva. But Anderson Silva is one of the greatest fighters ever. He kept believing it was possible. Out of nowhere, he caught a triangle as a choke in the 5th round and he won the fight. But let's be real. Understand this. Yes, by how the fights are judged and what the ending conditions of a fight are, Anderson Silva won the fight. In the spirit of what 99% of this fight was about, Chael Sonnen was beating and consistently beat and outclassed Anderson Silva in this fight. Now, people are going to say, yeah, but the thing is, Anderson Silva had an injured rib, and as a result, like, it's unfair. Well, then why does the doctor allow him to fight? Like, spoiler, that means you've hidden your injuries, by the way, to get into the fight. So you've already misled people if true, in which case, isn't that your own fault? Because at this point, you don't want to turn down the fight and lose the pay-per-view money and all the percentage because there's so much riding on it. You paid all the money for your camp. So I get it, but let's be real. Chael Sonnen and many others have also been injured in fights. They just get on and do the fight. In fact, it's a famous thing about Chael Sonnen. He says he doesn't pull out fights. Like, he'll make the walk no matter what, even if he's injured. And he often won't tell you he's injured until a long time later. And I'll add this in as well. If you know actually the sport of mixed martial arts, not just individual martial arts, you'll know that one of the things that makes it very tricky to strike against a really good wrestler who you know can take you down is knowing that if you don't hit them or that you hang out there, they can just get the takedown off you immediately. So I think that was also in Anderson Silva's head, as well as any sort of a rib fracture or whatever it might have been. Just as, if people remember, when John Jones fought that title fight against Glover Teixeira, you all thought Glover Teixeira was going to fuck him up and beat him up, right? But it seemed like Glover Teixeira was super gun shy, didn't it? He couldn't pull the trigger and really get into that fight in a fight because he was scared constantly John Jones could take him down, and that would be the angle by which John Jones would control him and then you never get back up again in that fight. So that is one of the things people don't seem to understand about the way that, like, the different martial arts interact with each other within the overall umbrella sport of mixed martial arts. Then let's keep going. After he loses the title fight, he's a massive name because of the trash talk. The trash talk against Anderson Silva makes his name. Before that, he's just a very good journeyman, like I've talked about, or a dark horse, or someone where you watch the fights, you go, he's winning this fight, but he lost, so that's why his record is. Basically, his record was worse than he was as a fighter. After this, he fought Brian Stan, who at the time was like a worse version of him, like a bit of a stand-up guy with some wrestling, who's obviously a famous army guy, and everyone was loving, like, the marketing angle of, like, wow, he's like a true American hero. Chael Sonnen easily beats this guy. Easily. Just completely controls him, subs him here with an arm in triangle choke. By the way, Chael Sonnen could sub people too. People don't know this. Just because he mocked Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the Nogueira brothers and getting a black belt, he was doing it the whole time in his career. He understood, by the way, in reality, it was a weakness and he had to get good at it. It's part of mixed martial arts. It's just that, one, he's a wrestler, and two, he's using trash talking. So if you're strong, he's going to say you're weak there, and if he's weak somewhere, he's going to say that doesn't matter, isn't it? He did always understand, by the way, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was really, really important. So he beats him, which gets him the title eliminated. Basically, whoever wins this one gets to be the next person to fight Anderson Silva. Now, if you saw this fight, this is again where scoring the fight versus who actually, like, in spirit won is very different. Because I would say in spirit, Michael Bisping won this fight. It's a close fight, but I would say, if you understand that they do overvalue takedowns, and back then takedowns are sometimes nothing happens from, then by that logic, Chael Sonnen did win the fight. And let's be real, behind the scenes, I understand it's not the UFC who controls the judges and assigns them, but the UFC must have wanted this to be a win for Chael Sonnen, because you want the rematch against Anderson Silva. You know he's going to trash talk. It's going to be enormous. Michael Bisping, at this point in time, would be expected to lose to Anderson Silva, even though, by the way, he's a very good fighter and already starting to, like, be in his prime at this point in time. But it's not as big a name. He can trash talk, but it's not the same rivalry. You don't have the rematch, and obviously already Chael Sonnen now is a massive pay-per-view draw. So I think it worked out best, except for everyone except Michael Bisping, basically, that Chael Sonnen Sonnen wins this fight. This is actually the fight, by the way, where I think he finally said in an interview that even though he said before he'd never lost a round, he didn't agree this time. He actually thought this time he probably had lost a round or two. I believe he even told Michael Bisping before the decision that he actually thought Michael Bisping took the win. So is that when he lets the facade drop, he actually seems like a very genuine, earnest guy. I want to say a totally honest person, because people might know some of the potentially criminal things he's done, but I do think there's a lot more there as the person than people know. In fact, if people don't know, he's taking care of people financially, like Mark Munoz, etc. When they had like injury issues or something, or needed money for surgery, seems like quite a cool guy who kind of gets it. If you listen to his kind of background, etc. Then after this, he gets the rematch with Anderson Silva. Now, if you remember, this was huge. The trash talk before, everyone's ready. And because of the first fight, if you saw the first fight, you had to think, dude, isn't there a world where like either Anderson was injured and therefore Anderson fucks him up, or maybe Chael Sonnen could just do that again? Now, here's where I do have to question that thing about the rib. Because if Anderson Silva had the broken rib in the fight in 2010, in August the 7th, 2010, why does he have a broken rib on the 7th of July, 2012, almost 2 years later? What I mean by that is, the first round of Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen 2, basically could have just been a round from the first fight. Chael Sonnen just takes him down, controls him the whole time, beats him up, poshes him from within the guard, and just beating him up. And by the way, Anderson Silva has that look on his face like, have I got like 20 more minutes of this to go on? Like, I already had this last fight. Then, in the second round, though, remember when he often loses? That's when Chael Sonnen does the classic brain fart, which has been part of the problem of his career. It's not that he's a total choker. He's winning to a certain point, and then out of nowhere, it's like he always gives his opponent a chance to win. So if you remember what happened in that fight was in the second round, he comes out, and you have this crazy sequence where simultaneously he tries a spinning back fist. Why he'd try that as like not an elite striker, I don't know. He misses. It causes him the trip. He falls down, and then basically, Anderson Silva pounces, and all I'll say is I've rewatched this footage a million times. I don't know, I feel like I can make myself see both sides. Part of me thinks if you look at the angle, it might have been an illegal knee to a downed opponent. Part of me thinks if you look where he hit me, it might have just been legit. But basically, the spin followed by the miss with this move is what ends the fight, essentially. This is why he loses the second time. It's a much less convincing fight, even though he would have won the first round, certainly, and the second round, there wasn't very much to it. So at this point in time, he's lost another title fight. Obviously, the rivalry's somewhat set now. Anderson Silva wins it 2-0. Like I say, the first round of that one's very close, but the first fight was basically chills. This is like the whole Leon Edwards, Usman, or Adesanya Pereira thing where people talk like one of them, because of the record, is dominated all the fights, but then you go watch the fights and actually the other person could have had the winning record. So just shows you how stupid MMA fans are with the stupid thinking about, like, oh, it's just a decision on what the fucking judges say. Now you have to use your eyes and your brain, believe it or not, guys. But after this, if you remember, because now he's had 2 cracks at Anderson Silva, who people assume until he retires he's going to be middleweight champion, because we all thought he was like the GOAT at this point in time. It was between him and GSP, right? I always thought Fedor, but that's me, isn't it? I like pride as well. After this, he goes up to light heavyweight, and famously, because John Jones needs a last-minute opponent, he actually gets to fight John Jones for the title at light heavyweight. Now, I will say, I do think middleweight was the right weight for Chael Sonnen, because he always made his weight cut and it allowed him to use his weight advantage and physically dominate people. You saw when you compared him to John Jones, who maybe could have been a heavyweight his whole career, he just looked normal next to John Jones. It's like when you see Allen Iverson. Allen Iverson, by the way, is like over 6 feet tall. So he'd be as tall as me or taller. So above average, like a tall person. But you see him in the NBA, he looks tiny, doesn't he? That's what it was like when Chael Sonnen went up. So I actually understand why earlier in his career he didn't fight a light heavyweight. But you know how it is in the UFC. If you lose and you can't win the title, especially if you're talking, you may as well move up or down the division and try and make some noise there. So he gets the last minute fight against John Jones. Now this one, by the way, is not even vaguely a competitive fight. He gets absolutely fucking mauled from the beginning of the bell to the end of the first round. He loses in a TKO, getting absolutely fucked up with no defense at all, because John Jones is enormous, and by the way, probably the real GOAT of MMA. But people might remember there's a detail. Just as if Anderson Silva didn't get that triangle choke, Chael Sonnen would have been the middleweight champion. I don't know if people know this, because there's a detail about this fight that's sometimes mentioned, but sometimes not, is that after this fight ended with, as you'll see, 4:33 in the first round, So you only had like seconds, tens of seconds before the round would be over. If people don't know, it turned out that John Jones, in fucking Chael Sonnen up, had actually broken his toe and it snapped like sideways. And you see this after after the fight. So basically, if Chael had gotten to the end of the round and just survived, it is almost certain the medical doctor would just stop the fight. And I'm not joking, Chael Sonnen would have been made the light heavyweight champion in his first fight there in the UFC over fucking John Jones, right? I always thought this anyway, which is if he'd have actually beaten Anderson Silva, wouldn't that have been insane, right? Obviously, either time. If he'd have beaten John Jones, even though he'd have known in this case it wasn't legit like the Anderson Silva one, he would have trash talked and had a shit-eating grin so much the whole time. You would have had to have a John Jones rematch. In the meantime, he would have cut so many promos. It really is a shame this guy never became a champion, but I'll come back to that. After the John Jones fight, a lot of people, because he talks all this trash, and then it was just an irrelevant fight against John Jones, even though he said apparently before the fight he did believe he'd be able to do something against John Jones, but once he got in there, he realised he's just way better than me. After that, he fought Shogun, one of my all-time favourite light heavyweight fighters. I actually think like a sleeper contender for one of the best light heavyweights to ever fight in any weight class, in any promotion, anywhere in history. Fabulous, fabulous fighter. And he fucking submitted him. Now, first of all, Shogun is like obviously like a Muay Thai striker and a kickboxer. He's mainly about striking. But everyone in Brazil does fuck tons of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This is no joke for someone with a wrestling background to fucking guillotine choke Shogun Rua. Now, yes, this is Shogun Rua after the knee surgeries and the loss to fucking John Jones. This is also Shogun Rua who's just had those epic fights with fucking Dan Henderson that were like fight of the year and did insane fucking damage to both of them and like took them to the limit. So this is actually when Shogun's still somewhat good. He's still capable of winning fights against people. And actually Chael just straight up handles him. Then after that, you have a fight against Rashad Evans, which sadly you hoped to be good, but it was more comparable to the Jones fight. It was basically just Rashad Evans fucking him up the whole time. And like I say, that's really, for me, sort of the end of Chael being a legit fighter. He fights Tito Ortiz. I'll just say it. This looks like a rigged fight. I'm just going to put that out there. The way it ends doesn't seem to really make sense at all. Even though I will say, even though Tito had a very bad record for like the latter half of his career, again, if you look at some of his fights, actually sometimes they're competitive or he's in them or he has chances to sub people or finish them, but he just isn't able to. And Tito, because he himself was, I mean, he was just a bad trash talker and some people liked him and he was a great champion at one point, but some people thought, I mean, he's a bozo. I just think people actually thought, they were hating on Tito, and then so because you've lost to Tito, you must be trash. But to me, it's just Chael Sonnen finds a way to lose by submission. That's his fatal flaw as a fighter. Then he did get the Vanderlei Silva fight he pushed for many, many, many years. By the way, if people don't know, the reason why when Vanderlei Silva came at him on tough, he actually did like start fighting him is because Chael Sonnen, from his dad, who was very influential on his life, had this thing he was taught by his dad called, don't ever let people get within your space, which is something like, roughly like an arm's distance. Because once they're within that space, you're not going to be able to react, are you? They can hit you, they can attack you, can do all. So his logic that his dad told him was if you tell them when they're coming towards you, don't come any closer. That's why he says, I can't let you get close. But if they come within that space, then you neutralize them. So you use your wrestling, you control them, you neutralize them. I actually get it. That's part of why, basically, obviously, even though people like me on Vanderlei Silva, he is like a monster. He can still catch you, he can still fuck you up, still willing to trade a million punches to give you one. There's still a world he can clip you and catch you. That's a dangerous fighter. It's not just some bum. So at the same time, though, they're both mega old at this point. So there's win by decision. It's like, who cares? Then he fights Rampage. Rampage at this point has probably had 10 years of having difficulties, like properly training, weight cuts. He's only fighting for money, seemingly. Yeah, he has knockout power, but who really cares? So this decision wins like, all right. Remember, the real weight class for Chael Sonnen was middleweight. So these light heavyweight battles don't really matter in this case. I mean, that one actually took place in fucking heavyweight because even Rampage, like I said, doesn't want to cut weight anymore, so they're at heavyweight now. Then you have another heavyweight fight. He actually gets to fight Fedor in the end. Oh yeah, don't worry. Chael Sonnen fought Anderson Silva at middleweight, John Jones at light heavyweight, and fucking Fedor at heavyweight. You are aware those are like arguably the three goats and the goat of each of their divisions, and he got to fight them all. It's crazy, isn't it? He fought Fedor right at the end when Fedor's a bazillion years old too, just doing legacy fights. Unsurprisingly, Fedor knocks him out, and then he fought Lyoto Machida, someone he actually obviously always trash talked a little bit too and said he was a karate guy, so you knew eventually another Brazilian was going to fight him. This time Lyoto Machida unsurprisingly knocked him out, and that was the end of Chael Sonnen's career. Now, there is a component in connected to what I said about Chael Sonnen and how influential his dad was to him, that I think people don't know and therefore can't shade into the narrative about what happened in Chael Sonnen's career. So one of the reasons why I actually think Chael Sonnen had performance anxiety and would just have these moments he would get submitted or would just lose in the big title fights and wouldn't look his best is actually because supposedly when his dad was dying, he visited his dad, I think this is before all these fights, and whispered in his ear something like, I mean, it's implied that he promised him I will become a world champion one day. So unfortunately, I think that got in his head. I think that was something that when he got to this level and he was in the winning position, I think potentially he would think about it. It was in the back of his mind, or like, you're not just doing it like, am I winning the fight? Am I going to win this fight? Am I doing it right? It's like, oh, I'm going to like fulfill the dream of my father. I can tell you, people who do that, even though in a movie it would be what would make you'd win in the end, in real life, sometimes that fucks with people. That's too much extra pressure. It's too many intrusive thoughts. It's something else you don't want to flash up in a moment where you're about to win and suddenly you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, as the old cliche goes. So I actually do think that's a part people don't appreciate, because like I say, there's a world where Chael Sonnen was the middleweight champion from the first silver fight. The second one, I have my questions about the illegal knee angle. The John Jones one, he actually would have won just by the doctor ending, which would be ridiculous. And then the Fedor one, look, that's donkeys years later. It's not really a championship fight, but it is one of the greatest of all time. I mean, they're just both so old at that point in time. And Fedor still had knockout power his whole career, no matter who he was fighting and at what time in the era. The skill set of Chael Sonnen was fabulous for MMA. He was an excellent wrestler, one of the best elite wrestlers ever to fight in MMA. His double leg was at one point the best, I think, we're talking around like 2010, he had the best double leg in MMA. He could keep you down before Khabib. He had control. He would fucking ground and pound you the whole time. Yeah, he didn't have hard fists, but he's doing damage and he's scoring on the fucking score count. I can tell you that much. People might not actually give him any credit for his hands because he didn't have knockout power, but this is a guy who has had won Golden Gloves awards in like regional shit, etc. He could box. He actually did outbox Anderson Silva, like I say. Yeah, maybe because of fear of the takedown, but plenty of other people could have threatened the takedown, and Anderson Silva wouldn't be that scared, would he? Now, there's also one other thing I want to show you quite quickly to show that even statistically, there's a basis that Chael's actually quite underrated. So if we go up here to records, right, look at Chael's records in the UFC. So he has the most control time in the middleweight division, the history of it. The most control time of every fighter to ever fight. By the way, middleweight was stacked division and it had loads of really good wrestlers. Then he has the highest control time percentage in the division's history. He has the most top position time, so he's constantly on top of his opponent controlling them. He has the highest top position percentage. He has the highest significant strike percentage. Just punches, significant strike. He's doing the most. He's constantly active. He has the fewest strikes absorbed per minute. So this is like a plus minus in counter strike. He's like an AWP who's just dominating the opponent. He has the fifth most takedowns landed in the division history. Remember, he fought half his career after this in light heavyweight and heavyweight. He has the fourth highest takedown percentage in the division's history. He has the most total strikes landed in a division fight, which was the Anderson Silva fight, 320. And he has the most total ground strikes landed, also in a fight, 303. This guy was absolutely an underrated fighter. He just had a fatal flaw. And then we, of course, come to the aspect of him being a talker, right? Now, if you don't know, not only because he was a real wrestler, like a Greco-Roman type wrestler and freestyle wrestler, etc. Not only was he like a real wrestler in the Olympic sense, an Olympic alternate, but he's someone who was a fan of fake/professional wrestling. WWE, WCW, WWF back in the day. And you can see the influence because his skills on the mic are just like great showmen in WWE, right? He's cutting promos left, right and centre with the post-fight interviews and the interviews before the match, etc. He's incredibly witty. Think about some of the lines he had against Anderson Silva and other people over the years, like the one where it was about like, oh my, I didn't know you had computers in Brazil. Like, what an insane comeback to them getting mad. The whole like Nogueira brothers, like, they were trying to like feed a boss a carrot. They thought that was like a fucking horse or something. They were going to take it home with them. You have the whole thing where when he was fighting Tito Ortiz and he made that comment about the only one who made money with their mouth was Tito's wife. And then Tito tried like some wacky comeback and Tim was like, that's a nasty line by me. You remember that one? He's just toying with him mentally and verbally, wasn't he? The real problem is this. I alluded to it earlier. Man, if he'd have won that first silver fight, MMA would have gone to a level it didn't get to for years. Like, he would have basically been Conor McGregor before Conor McGregor without the Irish theme, basically. Like, if he'd have beaten Anderson Silva, I can tell you, loads of Americans love winners. That whole USA, people would love this guy talking shit on the mic and beating the greatest champion ever. By the way, Anderson Silva was thought of as the GOAT at the time. Imagine if he'd have had a tour as a champion and gotten to fight people and cut these promos. How about if he wins the second Silva fight? Then he'd be able to go like, I basically beat you the first time, but you got lucky. And then now I beat you the second time. That would have been fire. The Jones one, like I say, would more be just for entertainment. Even he would be doing it knowing behind his grin, like, oh, of course I lost. I got my fucked up and I'll lose the second time. So to me, you look at some of the great trash talkers in the modern day, they're obviously all influenced by this guy. Like Conor McGregor, clearly, he even used to give it up, clearly influenced by him. Colby Covington, literally even calls him Uncle Chael and even says he was somebody he looked up to back in the day, he's friends with. They all copied from his style and took things from him, and he took himself what they did in WWF and WCW and somewhat like applied it to MMA and made it cool there and gave people a different angle, whereas before, like I say, when people like Thales Leites and Anderson Silva, it was just a fight and it was a boring fight and it didn't have the surrounding things that you needed to give it some spice and make you care about the fight beyond how good are these fighters and they're gonna fight. So yeah, I think Chael Sonnen, one of the most underrated MMA fighters of all time. Certainly he wasn't some dominant champion. He had his flaws. He lost a lot of fights. But look at what he did at his best against the best and when he was actually in the best scenarios and how close he was to being a champion. Obviously, my main gig is over in esports on my main channel, but my side channel and all my content around my other interests here are kindly supported by my Patreon community on Thorin's side here. So do you want to ask me a question for my video AMA? Do you want to take part in a private one-on-one exclusive, never to be released but recorded for you session? Call it consulting, call it just a conversation if you want. Do you want to find out who upcoming guests are for the Thor Inquiry episodes? If any or other perks like this take your interest, check out the Patreon link in the description box below and join Thorin's side today.